Today we're going to be talking about inheritance. And when I say the word inheritance, you may think of a couple different things. It's definitely a biological term, and that's the sense that we're going to be talking about it in today. But you may also think, that you can inherit something from a relative. Maybe you had a great uncle or a grandparent that passed away, and they left you an inheritance. They left you, a collection of stamps, or they left you a car, or they left you something, and that was your inheritance. And the term is similar, right? You're getting something from a previous generation. And that's what inheritance is in a biological sense. It's the traits and the genes and the alleles that you inherit from your parents. And your parents inherited those from their parents, and so far, up the chain. And one day you may pass your traits on through inheritance. So when we look at organisms, of all kinds are going to have some way of transferring their genetic information to the next generation. Whether it's a single-celled organism that's using a very kind of primitive form of RNA, or whether it's a eukaryotic organism like us, we're going to be able to pass on our traits. The traits that made us and helped us be successful, we're going to pass those traits on. And as I've stated before, if you have traits that didn't make you very successful, especially in the natural world, right? You may not survive long enough to pass those traits on, because if those traits were the ones that led to your early demise, then you're not going to be able to pass those traits on because you're not going to reproduce. So for the most of this, we're going to be talking about humans and just stick with kind of humans and their chromosome number and all that sort of thing. So for chromosomes, when we're looking at human chromosomes, we have genes on there. And there's different spots located on the chromosomes, and those locations contain genes. So if we're looking at this chromosome, and we've got this chromosome is from our mom, and this chromosome here is from dad. Okay? So you have lots of chromosomes that you inherited. You inherited 23 pair, 23 came from mom, 23 came from dad. On these chromosomes, you're going to have locations that are in the same spot as one another. And in those spots, they are going to code for a particular protein. And we call that a gene. And these genes are located in the same location on the same chromosome. So let's say this is chromosome number 11. This is chromosome number 11 from mom and chromosome number 11 from dad. And there's, hundreds of genes on this chromosome, and they each have a particular location, and they match up with this homologous chromosome, the chromosome from the opposite sex parent. So that's where we actually have it's not just this random place where genes are. We can say that we know that the gene that helps determine how tall you are is on chromosome 11 in this location. And that's just one of the genes that helps determine that, right? But no matter what the case, no matter what the gene, for the traits that we have, most of them are going to be comprised of a gene, and then there's going to be two alleles for that gene. And remember, an allele is the different form of a gene. So for example, if this gene up top here of chromosome 11, it deals with our eye color, mom may have given you a dominant allele, and dad may have given you a recessive allele, and so the chromosome that you get is going to read big B, little b. You're going to be heterozygous, and you're going to have the dominant allele and the recessive allele, and you're going to express the dominant trait. Okay? Because most of these alleles follow the dominance pattern, where we have dominant alleles and recessive alleles. And you get one from one parent and one from another, and then they match up, and then you either have the dominant trait or the recessive trait. So the only way you're going to have a recessive trait, the only way you're going to inherit a recessive trait, is if both parents give you a recessive allele. So we would have to remove this dominant from mom. You would both have to have they would both have to have a recessive allele and pass those recessive alleles on to you. Okay, because remember, if there's any presence of a dominant allele, it's going to cover up that recessive allele. So that's why a lot of times we see more dominant traits than recessive. But in populations where recessive is the norm, you're going to see a lot more of it. And what I mean by that is, for example, red hair is a recessive trait. Okay, so in a general population, you're not going to see as many people that have red hair, because if you have a redheaded mom and father who has brown hair, and if the father donates a dominant trait, then that will cover up the red hair. However, in populations where everybody has red hair, like in a population of Ireland, let's say, where red hair is very common, a lot of your parents are going to be homozygous recessive. And both parents will be homozygous recessive because both of them are redheaded. So when they produce offspring, they're all going to have red hair because that's the only option. There's no dominant alleles in that gene pool. And so you're not going to see a lot of the different traits. It doesn't mean that there's not Irish people that don't have red hair. I'm just saying in an environment like that or in a place like that, you're going to see a lot more of it. Whereas in other places where you have a lot of mixing, you're not going to see that. So it doesn't always have to be, it would be great if this was the case and this was always how it worked out. If there were two alleles and one was dominant and one was recessive and, everything was inherited that way, it would make the studying of this, a lot easier. But that's not the case. There are different patterns in what we call autosomal inheritance. Autosomal inheritance refers to our first 22 chromosomes, which is where most of the activity occurs in determining our traits. So we have a situation called codominance. And in codominance, again, scientists being incredibly crafty with the wording, codominance simply means that you have inherited two dominant alleles and neither one of them are really taking a back seat to the other. So for example, let's say that in a population, black is a dominant color and that white is also a dominant color, okay? And this occurs in chickens a lot, right? What you have happen is sometimes you have a chicken that is born with the genotype BW, and they're both dominant alleles, and they both act as dominant alleles. And what you wind up with is a speckled chicken. You wind up with a chicken that has black and white spots. And if you've ever been to a farm and seen a lot of chickens running around, you've probably seen one of these guys. This is the most classic example of codominance that you can think of. Again, it doesn't blend. Black doesn't cover up white. It's literally just both alleles are being expressed as dominant alleles. Okay. Another situation that we wind up with through this pattern or through a different pattern is called multiple. It's not even called anything. It's just multiple alleles, right? So if we think, in what terms of what we've been talking about, it's either light, it's either brown hair or red hair, blue eyes or brown eyes. But we know that that's not the case. If we look around and look at people's other eye color, we know that there's a lot of different possibilities. We can have green eyes, we can have blue eyes, brown eyes, gray eyes, hazel, eyes that tend to turn blue when they're in the right light, all these different possibilities, right? And that's because there's multiple alleles. So there's multiple alleles which can come together. There's still only going to be two, but because the pool of alleles is larger, depending on how they get mixed, right? You may have an individual who's like this, or who's like this, or who's like this, or like this, and then all of those result in different possibilities, right? Different because the pool is larger, because you have more alleles than just the two. Another situation that can result out of this autosomal inheritance is what we call incomplete dominance. So that is where it's a situation like codominance, where you have two dominant alleles. Okay, in this case, we're going to say this is going to be for flower color. We're going to have a dominant allele, which is red, and another dominant allele, which is white. And they produce a seed which has the genotype RW. And instead of being red or being white or being red and white speckled like the chicken, you wind up with a pink flower. You wind up with a blending. And again, as the name implies, neither one is completely dominant over the other, so you wind up with a blending. This is what we originally thought we were going to see when we started crossing organisms. We thought, you take an organism, you take another organism, they reproduce sexually, and they just kind of blend together, right? No one really anticipated, that what Mendel discovered is that you're going to have these dominant alleles that cover up recessive alleles and all this other stuff. He just thought maybe if you take a tall plant and a short plant and you mix them, you get a medium height plant. Right? And we know today that that's not the case. And then the last situation where it's not as simple as one allele or the other, and that is with polygenic traits. And again, we're talking about a trait where there is more than one gene that determines the trait. Okay, so I alluded to it earlier, and I talked about a gene that determines how tall you are, and I said it may be one of the genes that determines how tall you are. There are several genes in your body that determine how tall you are. So that's why we don't have everybody. If there was just one gene that determined how tall every person was, then everybody would either be one height or the other. But because we have multiple genes that determine how tall we are, we have lots of variation in height. And you can see that in your family, right? Your mom and dad are not the exact same height. You and your siblings aren't all the exact same height. If you have a sibling who's extremely tall, let's say they're 6 inches taller than you, they, on all of their genes, may have inherited a tall allele on every single one of them, and you may not have, or vice versa. You may be the tall one. So because of the fact that there's a lot of genes that contribute to that trait, that makes that inheritance pattern that much different. So those are all autosomal. Those occur on chromosomes 1 through 22. So if we line all of our chromosomes up, we're talking about the first 22 pair. The last 22 pair of chromosomes are our sex chromosomes. And if you are a female, you inherited 2 X chromosomes. You inherited 1 X from mom and 1 X from dad. If you are a male, you inherited 1 X from mom and you inherited your Y chromosome from dad. So females only have those 2 X chromosomes. That's all they can give. Males have an X and a Y. So mom is always going to donate an X, and then it's going to determine what's going to determine the gender of the offspring is going to be the father. If he donates an X chromosome, then it's a girl, like the mom. If he donates a Y chromosome, then it's going to be a male, like the father. And the inheritance pattern is a little bit different for sex-linked, but it's different because of the composition of the chromosomes, right? They don't follow the same patterns as the autosomal chromosomes. So if we lay all of our chromosomes out and we look at them, we can line them up from smallest to largest. That's called a karyotype. We'll start with chromosome 1 and we'll go through all of our chromosomes, and we just have chromosome 1 paired with chromosome 1 and chromosome 2 paired with chromosome 2 all the way down to the sex chromosomes. And the Y chromosome, if you happen to be a male, is by far the smallest chromosome. It's about half the size of the X chromosome, and that leads to some of those differences that I was talking about with sex-linked traits. So it doesn't matter, human or otherwise, that inheritance is going to happen. Those traits are going to be passed down from one generation to the next to ensure that new organisms that are coming along have the traits that are going to make them the most successful in their particular environment.